Imagine this. You are 20,000 feet above the Pacific, strapped inside the thin aluminum skin of a B-17 flying fortress. The world below is endless blue, a vast emptiness broken only by the faint outline of an enemy ship. Your heart pounds. You release your bombs, but in truth, it is no act of skill. It is chance. A cruel lottery where the odds are 1 in 100. For every single hit, 99 miss. And each miss means hours of deadly flying, of flak exploding around you, of enemy fighters clawing at your wings. This is not warfare. It is survival against impossible numbers. And yet, these young men kept flying because surrendering the skies meant surrendering the Pacific. What would you do if courage meant facing almost certain failure again and again? By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had reached a desperate crossroad. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy moved like a phantom, conquering island after island. Their ships ruled the seas, their planes ruled the skies. Against this tide, General Douglas MacArthur's Air Force was shattered. The men who returned from the Philippines were not eager heroes. They were survivors, exhausted, wounded, and haunted by battles they could not win. At MIA Airfield in Australia, the truth was stark. 32 B-17 bombers stood in the lineup. Fewer than half could still fly. The rest were stripped for parts, skeletons cannibalized to keep a few planes alive. This was not an Air Force. It was a lifeline, fraying strand by strand. Into this wreckage stepped General George C. Kenney, appointed commander of the 5th Air Force in July 1942. He had no reinforcements, no miracle weapons waiting in the wings, only patched-up planes and weary men. His task was cruelly simple: find a way to fight or watch the Pacific fall. And in that moment of despair, a single daring idea began to take shape. The first missions after Pearl Harbor were not victories. They were ordeals. Crews of the 19th Bomb Group climbed into their flying fortresses, engines coughing, wings patched with sheets of tin, and set course for the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. They flew high, 25,000 feet, the bomb bays filled, every man praying for a miracle. But the truth soon became undeniable. From that altitude, hitting a moving ship was almost impossible. Less than 1 bomb in 100 ever struck home. The rest splashed harmlessly into the Pacific. And for each futile attempt, crews endured hours of terror, flak bursting around them, enemy fighters slicing through their formations, exhaustion grinding them down. Morale collapsed. These were not men eager for glory. They were survivors, counting the days until they could see home again. Letters written from Australia spoke not of triumph, but of despair. "We are flying skeletons held together by wire," one airman confessed. "We take off not knowing if the plane or our nerves will last the night." At Port Moresby, the situation grew dire. Bombers limped back from missions riddled with holes, engines on fire, crews pale and hollow-eyed. Ground crews scavenged what they could from wrecks, stripping 3 planes to make 1 fly. In the officers' tents, commanders whispered the question no one dared speak aloud: how long can this go on? Yet the orders never stopped. Guadalcanal had been invaded by American Marines in August 1942, and their survival depended on air support. If Rabaul's warship sailed freely, Guadalcanal would be lost. And if Guadalcanal fell, Australia itself might be next. So the men flew again, and again. Each mission another roll of the dice with lives as the wager. They knew the odds, they saw the misses, and still they climbed into their flying fortresses. Not because they believed in victory, but because surrender was unthinkable. In those desperate months, courage did not mean confidence. It meant flying into the storm when every calculation promised only failure. General George C. Kenney was not a man content with failure. When he assumed command of the 5th Air Force on July 29, 1942, he inherited a fleet that was more ghost than force. The proud 19th Bomb Group had returned from the Philippines broken, their machines battered, their spirits drained. Conventional high-altitude bombing had proven worthless. If he kept sending men on the same missions, he would be wasting lives for nothing. Kenney began searching for another way. His eyes turned to a quiet, methodical officer on his staff, Major William Benn. Ben had studied the failures carefully. He knew the Norden bomb site, so praised in Europe, was useless in the Pacific. Ships were not factories or rail yards. They moved, zigzagged, and by the time a bomb fell 4 miles through the air, the target was already gone. Precision at altitude was a myth. What if, Ben wondered, they turned the logic upside down? Instead of flying high, what if they flew dangerously low, so close to the ocean that anti-aircraft gunners could barely track them? What if a bomb could be made to skip, like a stone across a pond, until it slammed into the side of a ship? With a fuse timed for a few seconds, it could slip beneath the waves and explode under the hull, breaking a vessel's back with a devastating underwater blast. To most commanders, the idea sounded suicidal. Flying a heavy bomber directly at a warship bristling with guns was little more than a death wish. The British had tried something similar and abandoned it as too dangerous. But Kenny and Ben were not in Britain. They had no luxury of caution. Every conventional tactic had failed. Desperation demanded invention. And so, in the heat of the Australian sun, an impossible question became a plan. Could a flying fortress, built to soar 6 miles above the earth, be transformed into a low-level predator skimming the waves? The gamble was insane. But it was the only gamble left. To turn theory into reality, the men of the 63rd Bomb Squadron needed a target. Not a chalkboard sketch or a paper calculation, but something solid, something they could attack without sinking their own allies. They found it in the rusting carcass of the SS Pruth, an old freighter that had run aground near Port Moresby, New Guinea. For years it had sat stranded on a reef, battered by waves. Now it would serve as the proving ground for a new kind of warfare. Major William Benn gathered his crews. He explained the daring idea: dive to wave-top level, release the bombs just 50 feet above the ocean, and let them ricochet forward like skipping stones. With a timed fuse, the explosion would tear a ship apart from beneath. It sounded bold. It also sounded like madness. The first practice runs nearly confirmed their fears. Australian-made fuses, designed for 10 or 12 seconds, behaved unpredictably. Some bombs bounced too high, even threatening to strike the aircraft itself. Others sank without detonating. Worst of all, the delays varied wildly. 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or sometimes instantly. Every flight was a roll of the dice with death waiting at the toss. Lieutenant James Murphy later remembered the terror of those early attempts. Flying a 4-engine bomber at 200 miles an hour, barely 50 feet above the waves, only to watch bombs careen unpredictably toward the shipwreck or back toward the bomber. Every run felt like tempting fate, he wrote. But necessity drove persistence. Ordnance crews in makeshift workshops began tinkering with the fuses, filing them, rewiring them, trying to cut the delay to the magic 5 seconds. It was dangerous, delicate work. One wrong spark could kill the handler, yet, little by little, they produced fuses that worked just well enough. And then came the first true success. A bomber skimmed in low, the bombardier released, and the weapon skipped across the waves, slammed into the Pruth's rusted hull, and erupted beneath the surface. Water and flame geysered skyward. The impossible had become real. The flying fortress could fight at sea level. October 22, 1942. The night air over Port Moresby was heavy and damp, charged with tension. 12 flying fortresses of the 63rd and 64th Bomb Squadrons rumbled down the runways and lifted into the darkness. Their destination was Simpson Harbor at Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Pacific. The plan was daring. The 64th Squadron would climb to 10,000 feet, conducting a conventional raid. Their task was not to sink ships, but to draw fire, searchlights, flak, and the attention of Japanese gunners. Meanwhile, the 63rd would creep in low, hugging the waves, unseen beneath the chaos above. Captain Franklin Green led the way. Even before reaching the harbor, his crew spotted a cruiser and a freighter silhouetted against the moonlit water. He shoved his fortress down to 200 feet. Engines roared, bomb bay doors opened, and the crew braced. The bombs tumbled free, skipped across the waves, and smashed into the targets. In moments, both ships were aflame, fire lighting the night. Inside Simpson Harbor itself, more chaos erupted. Captain Carl Houston struck a 10,000-ton transport, igniting it from bow to stern. Captain Ken McCullough, flying his Fortress Blackjack, bore down on a Japanese warship and scored 2 hits along the waterline, crippling it. Japanese defenders reeled in shock. Searchlights swung wildly, flak exploded blindly, but the low-flying bombers were already gone. In less than an hour, at least 5 major vessels were sunk or crippled. It was, as one squadron historian later wrote, a jackpot night. When General Douglas MacArthur received the after-action report, he awarded Major William Benn the Distinguished Service Cross. For the weary 5th Air Force, it was more than a victory. It was proof that skip bombing worked. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the tide seemed to shift. The success at Rabaul electrified the 5th Air Force, but it also exposed a grim truth. The B-17 Flying Fortress, magnificent at high altitude, was ill-suited for the brutal demands of skip bombing. Look closely at its design. The fortress earned its name because it bristled with guns, dozens of them pointing upward, downward, and backward. At altitude, it was a hedgehog of steel, spitting fire in every direction. But in a skip bombing run, none of that mattered. The enemy was not above or behind. The enemy was straight ahead. And there, in the nose of the fortress, lay a fatal weakness. The bombardier's glassed-in station offered almost no forward firepower. As a B-17 lined up on its target, it became an enormous, unmissable silhouette, flying directly into the teeth of Japanese gunners. And in those final, crucial seconds before bomb release, the plane could not shoot back. At first, the shock of low-level attacks gave the Americans an edge. Japanese gun crews were unprepared, their fire panicked and inaccurate. But as raids continued, the element of surprise faded. The enemy adapted, and when they did, the fortress's vulnerability became deadly. Each run grew more dangerous. Crews returned with holes torn through fuselages, engines failing, men wounded. Some never returned at all. The Flying Fortress had proven that skip bombing could work, but to carry the tactic forward, the 5th Air Force needed a new tool, something faster, more agile, and armed to the teeth in the nose. In war, some revolutions are born in boardrooms, others come from hangars, grease, and sparks. Colonel Paul "Pappy" Gunn belonged firmly to the second kind. A former Navy pilot turned civilian engineer before the war, Gunn had a gift for seeing airplanes not as fixed designs, but as raw materials waiting to be reshaped. General George C. Kenney knew he needed something better than the Flying Fortress for low-level attack. The answer lay in the twin-engine B-25 Mitchell. It was smaller, faster, and more maneuverable than the B-17, but in its standard form, the Mitchell had one glaring weakness. Its nose carried only a couple of machine guns. Against a Japanese warship bristling with gunners, that was nowhere near enough. Pappy Gunn's solution was radical. He tore out the bombardier's station, declaring it unnecessary at treetop level. Then, he packed the empty nose with firepower. 4 heavy 50-caliber machine guns, all forward-facing under the pilot's control. He added blister packs on the sides of the fuselage, each carrying 2 more. The result was staggering. 8 forward-firing guns, capable of unleashing a hurricane of bullets in a single pass. With this modification, the B-25 was transformed. No longer merely a medium bomber, it became a predator, the Strafer. Crews could dive low, sweep enemy decks with gunfire, silence anti-aircraft crews, and then release their bombs at point-blank range. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. Against the B-17, at least they had a chance to shoot back. Against gun strafers, gun crews were cut down before they could even pull a trigger. The balance of fear shifted. The Americans were no longer prey. They had become hunters. In March 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army made a desperate gamble. Their troops in New Guinea were starving, cut off from supply. To save them, Tokyo dispatched a massive convoy, 8 destroyers, 7 transports, and more than 6,000 soldiers of the 51st Division. Their orders were clear: reach Leh at any cost, but Allied reconnaissance spotted the fleet in the Bismarck Sea. The chance was too great to ignore. For the 5th Air Force, this was the moment to unleash Pappy Gunn's newly modified B-25 Strafers in combat. On March 2nd, the first strikes began. B-17 flying fortresses attacked from altitude, scoring hits on transports and forcing the Japanese formation into disarray. But the real test came the following day. On March 3rd, more than 100 Allied aircraft descended on the convoy. Among them were 12 of gun Strafers. They flew so low their propellers nearly kissed the waves. As they closed on the Japanese ships, their noses erupted with fire. 8 forward-facing machine guns tore across the decks, shredding anti-aircraft crews before they could respond. Sailors fell, wood splintered, and guns fell silent. Then, at point-blank range, the bombers released their payloads. Bombs skipped across the sea, slammed into hulls, and exploded beneath the surface. In a single devastating run, 11 ships were struck. A destroyer and a transport sank instantly. Others burned furiously, dead in the water. Overhead, B-24s and B-17s pounded the survivors, turning the sea into a cauldron of fire and smoke. By the end of March 4th, the convoy was annihilated. All 7 transports and 4 destroyers lay broken on the seabed. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. The Allies lost only 13 airmen. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just a victory. It was a revelation. Skip bombing, once dismissed as madness, had destroyed an entire convoy. What began as desperation was now a decisive weapon. From the waters of the Bismarck Sea, a new chapter of naval warfare was written in fire. The victory in the Bismarck Sea was more than a tactical triumph. It marked a turning point in the Pacific War. In just 2 days, Allied airmen had erased an entire Japanese convoy, proving that control of the seas no longer belonged to warships, but to aircraft flying low and striking with devastating precision. The B-17 Flying Fortress had carried the burden through the darkest days. It proved that skip bombing could work, but its size and lack of forward firepower limited its role. By the end of 1943, most fortresses were gone from the Pacific, replaced by the longer-range B-24 Liberator and the deadly B-25 Strafer. Yet, to the men who had flown her, the fortress was more than a machine. She was a comrade, a steel guardian that brought them home when all odds said she should not. For Major William Benn, the pioneer of skip bombing, fate was cruel. He vanished on a reconnaissance mission in January 1943, before he could see the tactic reach its full triumph. For Captain Ken McCullough, Captain Franklin Green, and Lieutenant James Murphy, the memories of fire and steel would haunt them long after the war. And for Colonel Pappy Gunn, his genius in transforming the Mitchell gave the 5th Air Force the weapon it needed to turn the tide. The legacy of skip bombing endures. Divers who descend into Simpson Harbor or the Bismarck Sea still see the hulks of Japanese ships resting like iron tombstones beneath the waves. They are monuments to a revolution born of desperation and carried out with courage. Technology has moved on. Guided missiles and precision weapons have rendered skip bombing obsolete. No pilot today must skim the waves, staring into the muzzles of enemy guns, praying their bomb skips true. But the lesson remains. Innovation, even born from desperation, can change the course of history. This is the story of courage in its truest form, the courage to face impossible odds, to defy the rulebook, and to invent a new path to survival. In the waters of the Pacific, in the wrecks that still rest beneath the waves, the echoes remain. The echoes of engines at treetop level, the echoes of .50 caliber fire, the echoes of bombs skipping across the sea. And above all, the echo of men who, in the darkest hours of World War II, dared to change the rules. Men who gave us victory in World War II. Men whose courage and sacrifice remind us still that peace was purchased at the highest price in World War II.